a lot of people think of Africa as this bordered area that you cannot pass through any continent. And they also believe that Africans never left Africa until maybe somewhere in like 200 AD when Romans and stuff had come. But the truth is that scientists believe that black Africans from East Africa and perhaps other areas through the obsidian trade went through the Middle East, and some genetic evidence shows that some people in the Middle East might have some sub-Saharan African DNA that ventures back to this era. And of course, from 10,000 BC till today, that's a long time. And evidence keeps showing up that, 4,000 BC, when the Egyptians were around, that East Africans might have traveled into the Middle East. And so, even though they're a minority and that DNA would have been obscured, it's not like everybody would be looking at each other and they just see black people. There'd be a lot of Middle Eastern people too, so that the race would remain virtually Middle Eastern in the same sense that a lot of African Americans are mixed with white people, but because the overwhelming amount of sub-Saharan DNA forces them to have the appearance of sub-Saharan Africans. And of course, one of the latest ones is 900 BC. 900 BC, you find a lot of East Africans moving into the Middle East, Europe, and other places like that. And the reason why they move into these areas is due to trade, it's due to new civilizations that were interested in different communities, especially the Romans. And then, of course, you have closer times like today. In I think something like 10% of the Saudi Arabian population has traces to sub-Saharan Africa due to the slave trade, which is crazy. 10%. Think about that for a second. 10% of Saudi Arabians can trace their part of their lineage to sub-Saharan Africa, probably due to the slave trade. And now to read the study that was laid out by the Pub Medical free data site. This is a real study. Well, this is based on real studies. We have analyzed and compared mitochondrial DNA variations of populations from the Near East and Africa and found a very high frequency of African lineages present in the Yemen Hadwarmart. More than a third were a clear sub-Saharan African origin. Other Arab populations carried -10% lineages of sub-Saharan origin, whereas non-Arab Near Eastern populations, by contrast, carried few or no such lineages, suggesting that gene flow has been preferentially into Arab populations. Several lines of evidence suggest that most of this gene flow probably occurred within the past 2,500 years. In contrast, there is little evidence for male mediated gene flow from sub-Saharan Africa in Y chromosome haplotypes in Arab populations, including the Hadramawt. Taken together, these results are consistent with substantial migration from Eastern Africa into Arabia, at least in part as a result of the Arab slave trade, and mainly female assimilation into the Arabian population as a result of miscegenation and manumission. Contacts between Eastern Africa and Arabia has existed since the establishment of obsidian exchange networks as early as the 7th millennium BC. They were simulated by the growth of the Egyptian state from the 4th millennium onwards, with possible settlements of people from Arabia in the Horn of Africa as early as the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. The Afro-Arabian Tehama cultural complex, for which an African origin seems most likely, arose in the mid-2nd millennium, in addition to the coastal site of Adulis in Eritrea and sites farther inland in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan. It is represented on the Saudi coastal plains and the western and southern coasts of Yemen. Other traditions appear to have spread in opposite directions. This conglomeration of studies goes on and on and on, and it is a fact by now that sub-Saharan Africans existed at least since 10,000 BC in Arabia and those places. I could read the whole studies, but I think you could easily find it if you Google Afro-Asians and look at Asians in the Middle East or Africans in the Middle East. And of course, there's similarities with studies in Europe that show that in areas like the Canary Islands, or certain places where early civilizations show up, you find sub-Saharan DNA, and a lot of it is pre Egypt. A lot of the DNA that came from sub-Saharan Africa, and this is no surprise, of course, because we still have more DNA coming in, like 20,000 years ago to India. We've got these random tribes dotted around Asia that people until very recently couldn't explain why they were there. Anyway, that's about it. Subscribe.